The prairie fence cut a lonely shape against the quiet sky, its wood splintered where wind had bitten for years. The air hung still, thick with the hush that comes before a storm. A crow perched on the post above her head, its wings folded, its gaze patient, as if it had seen this kind of cruelty before. Alma Rosewood, 23 and threadbare as the quilt beneath her twins, hung by the wrists, bound to the fence with rough rope. Her dress was torn at the sleeves, the fabric streaked with dust and dried blood. Wind teased loose strands of her hair across her bruised cheek. At her feet, the newborn girls whimpered softly, their breaths shallow against the cold ground. They didn't cry like babies should. They didn't have the strength. The wagon carrying her in-laws rattled away down the dirt track, its wheels groaning. Abel Dorsey didn't glance back. Margaret sat stiff beside him, her bonnet tied tight beneath her chin like it might keep away the shame of the woman they'd left behind. A woman who can't give a man a son ain't worth keeping, Abel had spat before the rope bit into her wrist. They had not struck her as much as they had stripped her, of dignity, of place, of belonging. They left her in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but 2 frail lives cradled in a quilt that used to be her wedding gift. The breeze shifted, carrying with it the smell of dry sagebrush and distant rain. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what warm hands felt like. A faint hum of hoofbeats reached her ears then, steady, measured, like a heartbeat through earth. She opened her eyes and blinked against the light. A lone rider approached along the ridge, a man whose figure cut clean lines against the pale horizon. The horse beneath him was a deep chestnut, the kind that looked like it had run through too many storms and survived. The rider's hat shaded his face, but the angle of his body was unhurried, sure, like he was a man used to seeing hard things. James Callahan drew his horse to a stop a few feet from the fence. His eyes, gray as river stone, moved over the scene, not in shock, but in that heavy silence a man learns after seeing too much of the world's ugliness. His hands, calloused and sun-browned, loosened the reins and swung him down from the saddle with a quiet thud. His boots sank into the dust. The baby's soft whimpers cracked through the air like a wound too small to bleed out loud. He knelt slowly, not wanting to startle her. Alma didn't speak. Her throat felt like sand. He reached for his knife without a word, the blade glinting as he slid it beneath the coarse rope. His movements were practiced, not careless but certain, as if he'd freed someone from worse before. When the rope snapped, her arms fell like broken branches. She swayed forward, but he caught her before she hit the ground. His coat smelled faintly of horse and pine sap. She didn't fight him. She didn't have the strength to. "Can you stand?" His voice was low, a rasp shaped by long days in the saddle. She managed only the faintest shake of her head. He shifted his gaze to the quilt on the ground and the 2 tiny bundles within it. A muscle moved along his jaw. He lifted the babies first, careful as if they were something made of glass, and tucked them into his arms. One of them stirred, letting out a small cry like a bird testing its wings. Alma's chest burned. No one had ever looked at her children like they were worth holding. He came back for her then, looping his arm around her waist with a steady gentleness that made her knees give way. She sagged against him, her cheek brushing the rough fabric of his shirt. His breath warmed the side of her face when he spoke again. "You're coming with me," he said. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a simple truth spoken into a world that had taken everything else. He lifted her onto the horse with surprising ease, setting her sideways in the saddle so she could cradle the twins. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the quilt tighter around them. He swung up behind her and wrapped one arm loosely at her back, not to claim her, only to keep her from falling. The horse moved at a slow walk, its hooves whispering against the road. Above them, the sky held that soft, strange light that lingers before dusk, stretching shadows long and thin across the land. The town lay to the east, a scatter of buildings no one painted anymore, where gossip ran faster than horses. Folks would see her and say the widow had been saved by the quiet cowboy. They'd whisper the rest in corners where kindness never quite reached. She imagined their faces, the curl of their lips, and felt the old shame rise like smoke. But the rhythm of the horse beneath her steadied something inside. She closed her eyes and let the wind touch her like it hadn't in months. When they reached the cabin at the edge of the desert, the air smelled of dry grass and ash. James dismounted first, then held out a hand to her. She stared at it a long time before taking it. His hand was warm and rough. Inside, the cabin was modest. A single lantern, a wood stove, a table that had seen years. It wasn't much, but it didn't smell like cruelty. He set the twins in a basket lined with wool and knelt to light a fire. Sparks flared, and soon the room was wrapped in amber glow. Alma sank onto the small cot in the corner, her body aching from the rope, from the months before the rope, from everything. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her without ceremony. She drank slowly, each swallow stinging its way down her throat. He fed the babies warm goat's milk from a small bottle, his large hands oddly sure around something so fragile. She watched him move, not like a hero, not like a stranger trying to impress, but like a man who knew what silence could hold. "Why?" she whispered. It came out cracked, thin. His eyes met hers across the dim room. "Because no one deserves to die like that." The answer landed in her chest like a stone in a still pond, sending out quiet ripples. He didn't ask her where she came from. He didn't ask her to explain the bruises or the tears. He just kept the fire alive, as if that was reason enough. Outside, the wind softened to a hush. The night pressed close against the windows, but inside the light grew warmer. Her eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion seeping through bone. She heard the horse shifting outside, the crackle of the fire, the steady breathing of the babies. She'd been left at a fence to vanish, but here she was, breathing. Not safe yet, not healed, but breathing. And somewhere deep in that quiet, something small and stubborn began to flicker. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was close. The first light of dawn spilled through the cabin window like a soft promise, stretching over the wooden floor and catching on Alma's tangled hair. She woke to the faint sound of goats outside and the slow, steady rhythm of a man splitting kindling. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Her body still carried the ache of the fence, the bite of rope against her wrists, the weight of being discarded. But the smell of wood smoke and the low crackle of fire grounded her. This wasn't the place she had been left to die. This was somewhere else. Someone had chosen to bring her back. James stood just outside the open doorway, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, moving with quiet precision. He wasn't a man who filled silence with unnecessary talk. Every movement seemed shaped by some old sorrow he kept folded deep inside. Alma sat up carefully, wincing at the stiffness in her arms, then looked down at the twins. They lay in the basket near the hearth, warm now, their breathing soft and even. She brushed her fingers across their downy heads, a gesture more like apology than affection. She had nothing to give them. Not land. Not safety. Not a name the town would speak without curling their mouths around it. The town, though still distant, had a way of making itself present. She could feel its judgment like a wind that seeped through walls. She knew what they'd say. The widow who couldn't keep a husband, who gave birth to twin girls instead of sons. She'd heard worse before. It wasn't the gossip itself that frightened her. It was the way it always found a way to make her feel small, smaller than the fence she'd been tied to. James returned inside with an armful of wood, setting it gently beside the hearth. He nodded toward the cup of water on the table, wordless but clear. She drank without protest. He leaned against the doorframe, hat low over his eyes, as if measuring the shape of the morning before deciding whether to speak. "Town'll know by now," he said finally. "They always do." His tone wasn't bitter. It was just a fact, like the rising sun or the sound of coyotes after dark. She didn't answer. She wasn't sure what to say to a man who had pulled her from the edge of nothing and offered shelter without asking for anything in return. Her old life had been built on debts she could never pay. This new one, whatever it was, felt like standing in a place where the ground hadn't decided whether to hold or give way. He crouched beside the fire, poking at the coals until sparks lifted like tiny stars. "They'll talk," he continued. "They'll have their opinions. That's what folks do." She pulled the quilt around herself tighter, feeling the weight of those unseen eyes. "But you're safe here," he added, softer this time. She looked up at him, searching his face for some hidden motive, some reason why a man like him would trouble himself with a woman like her. All she saw was tiredness, plain and unvarnished. Days bled into one another, each carrying the shape of quiet routines. James rose early, tending the animals and the land with the kind of steadiness that comes from a man who's learned not to depend on much. Alma began to move through the cabin like someone relearning the shape of her own shadow. She fed the twins, mended a tear in his quilt, swept the floor though it didn't need it. Small, quiet gestures that gave her hands something to do when her heart grew too heavy. The babies grew stronger, their cries louder now, their tiny fists reaching toward light. Sometimes, in the stillness of evening, she caught James watching them with a look she didn't understand, part awe, part something else he'd never name out loud. The world beyond the cabin did not stay silent for long. Rumors, like wildfire, found their way up the dirt path. At the general store, people whispered into their palms. At the saloon, Abel Dorsey nursed a drink with bitterness clinging to him like dust. He spoke of his daughter-in-law as a shame, of her twins as a curse, of James as a man too foolish or too desperate to know better. Margaret, stiff-backed and sharp-eyed, fanned the flames with the kind of righteousness that only the cruel believe belongs to them. They made plans between bitter sips, believing their right over those babies was as fixed as the stars. One afternoon, when the sun bled low over the horizon, two dark figures rode up the path to James's cabin. Abel and Margaret dismounted with the deliberate stiffness of people who thought themselves owed something. Alma froze at the window, her fingers tightening on the edge of the curtain. Her chest tightened in that familiar way, the way it used to when her husband raised his voice, or when the in-laws counted her worth against the weight of a son she never gave them. James stepped outside before they reached the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than their threat. Abel's mouth twisted as he looked at the cabin, at Alma through the window, at the babies he thought belonged to his name. "We're talking what's ours," Abel said, his voice slick with cruelty he believed was justice. "You've no claim to them. She's got nothing. No husband. No land. No right." Alma's pulse roared in her ears. Margaret's eyes found her in the window, cold and narrow, as if willing her to shrink smaller than she already felt. James stood firm, boots planted in the dirt, the setting sun throwing a hard light across his jaw. "Not while I breathe," he said, the words carrying no drama, no shout, just an unmovable line in the sand. For the first time since she'd met him, Alma saw the storm beneath his quiet. Abel took a step forward, but the weight of James's stillness stopped him. The desert wind rose then, sharp and dry, pushing through the space between them like a warning. Margaret's bonnet fluttered against her neck, and her gaze flickered, not with fear, but with the uneasy recognition of someone who'd met a boundary they couldn't cross without consequence. Alma opened the door and stepped outside, the twins cradled to her chest. Her hands shook, but her back stayed straight. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The act of standing there, in the open, under their eyes, was louder than any word she could have found. Abel's face hardened. Margaret looked away. James's hand hovered at his side, not to reach for a weapon, only to be ready if the world forgot its manners. The standoff hung like a wire drawn too tight. Then, slowly, Abel spat into the dirt, turned on his heel, and mounted his horse. Margaret followed, her stiff spine cracking beneath the weight of defeat she'd never admit. As they rode away, the wind carried their anger with it, scattering it across the empty land where it belonged. Alma exhaled, a long, shaking breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. James looked at her, Not with pity, not with pride, just quiet acknowledgement. The kind that said she wasn't alone anymore. She shifted the twins higher in her arms. For the first time, the land around her didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a beginning. The sky above deepened to gold, then bruised purple, the desert whispering secrets it had kept too long. And as night fell, the cabin's windows glowed soft and steady against the dark, like a promise not yet spoken but already true.